Welcome back to the Photaudiography podcast. I'm your host Luke, and today I'll be talking all about histograms, how to read them, and why they are important. First, a histogram in photography is a mathematical representation of values of brightness and darkness for the exposure of your image. The reason checking out histograms is important is because looking at an image on the back of your camera may not be an accurate representation of the exposure of your image. LCD screens aren't good at conveying the exposure properly since they are affected by ambient light conditions and the brightness of the LCD screen itself. While this is true, you cannot rely solely on the histogram to decide whether your image is properly exposed. Let me first give you a little background on how to read the histogram and then go into more of their limitations. I'm going to describe the horizontal axis of the histogram now. On the horizontal axis, the far left of the histogram represents the darkest portions in your photo. In the middle of the horizontal axis, this represents the midtones of your image, which are neither dark nor light tones in the image, sort of the gray area. To the right of the midtones are the highlights in your image, and on the far right are the lightest tones of your image. Now the vertical axis of the histogram shows the amount of the particular amount of tones in that particular lightness or darkness category of an image. In other words, the higher the peak, the more dark or light is in that area of the image. If part of the histogram is either touching the extreme left or right, this indicates a loss of data or clipping of either the shadows or highlights of the image. You can adjust this clipping by adjusting the exposure settings of the image to accommodate for the clipping, but sometimes clipping cannot be recovered. With this in mind, most photographers look to make sure most of their peaks in the histogram are in the middle portion of the graph. If a photo has a lot of tones near the edges, the photo is most likely either over or underexposed to the point of clipping. The histogram is not necessarily the only thing you should look for when looking to see if the image is properly exposed. If you have, say, a picture of a wedding ring on a white background, the histogram will show very high spikes on the right-hand side, but the image will most likely be properly exposed. So looking at the histogram doesn't tell the whole story, but it is certainly an important piece of making sure your photo does not have any clipped data. Some cameras have a mode on them in playback mode that shows the highlight warning by blinking overexposed highlights on your image. This can be an easy way to see if there is any clipped data without having to analyze the histogram. Keep in mind that if you are shooting in JPEG, it is more important to nail the exposure because you have less editing latitude for adjusting the exposure. RAW photos allow you more editing latitude. However, if you have clipped data, even RAW photos have limitations where there is clipped highlights or shadows. You usually want most of the peaks of the histogram in the middle of the graph in sort of a bell shape. These type of graphs are usually good for determining that your image is properly exposed and there are no clipped highlights or shadows, but not all situations warrant a bell-shaped histogram. I'm going to describe a few scenarios of different histograms and what they look like. For example, a high contrast histogram shows strong peaks on the far left and right, and lower in the middle of the graph. These high contrast photos are very impactful, but very susceptible to losing details if the highlights or shadows get clipped. Low-key histograms have many peaks toward the left of the histogram and not very much to the right of the graph. These photos are normally very dark and dramatic, with emphasis on dark tones and some mid-tones. High-key histograms have many peaks towards the right of the histogram and not very much on the right side of the graph. These photos are normally very light and used to convey a happy or cheerful mood. These types of photos are very susceptible to overexposure and clipped highlights, so it is important to check the histogram to avoid any clipping. You may also see Rgb histograms showing the red, green, and blue histograms. These histograms can help you see the color saturation and give you an idea about the white balance of the image. These color histograms can see if any color from any of the 3 color channels is clipped from the image. Some mirrorless cameras that have electronic viewfinders will be able to show you the histogram while you're taking the photos, which is very helpful. Instead of having to check your playback information and look at the histogram to make sure there are no clipped highlights or shadows, you can view it right in the viewfinder. In summary, the histogram is a useful tool to make sure your images are properly exposed, since reviewing images based on a preview on the back of your camera can be limiting to deciding if an image is properly exposed and if there is any clipped highlight or shadow data that you won't be able to retrieve in editing. Alright, I think that's all the bad advice I have for now, so I'll see you later, Shutterbugs.